those are very well aimed because they deal with the kind of schedule that we have with the different blocks.
Mhm.
And it engages more blocks so that those academics are truly at risk. With the second violation, you get very shaky. And if it happens to be not alcohol related, if it happens to be chemical related, it's 10 days, and that's even more effective. So I think we've accomplished a great deal of what my hanging part would do in the handbook itself. Certainly, I think that the full year would resolve some other issues which I've seen while I've been on the committee. Those issues, things that happen during the summer, when the student body is right out there flaunting their anti-social behavior, or more social than they should behave if one or the other. And I guess that depends on which side of the fence you're looking at. And the intent of putting that in was to try to get rid of the situation where the students are working the system. But it appears that we're going to end up by having serious issues with that from a defense standpoint. And we obviously are, as I think Dr. Manville commented, we're only one part of the equation. The parents are the other part, and they have a responsibility during the summer when we're not acting as a patrol. The guilt by association, I guess I was, again, attempting to modify our students' behavior with that, and have them get up and walk out when they saw something that was going to cause them harm, potentially. But again, that raises the question of, is the red cup filled with water, or is it filled with something else? And how far away are they, and how can you prove anything? And there are people on this committee who have brought that to our attention more than one time. So, very likely that is something that we can't do very much with. At one interim period here, I thought maybe by putting a comment in the policy, something to the effect that it's recommended you get up and walk out, but that has no force of law or penalty or anything. They're going to laugh at that one, and we don't need to have them continue to laugh at us for things that are unenforceable. The mandatory treatment program was, I think the thought in mind when that was written was mandatory education. Mm-hmm. And certainly I think that's one of those things that we should be putting in there. And I think a program should be developed that deals with it. Could very easily be done during study periods or after school or online that the student should have to go through, and I think that ought to be included as a mandatory education for each event, and repeat it. If you didn't get it the first time and didn't learn from it the first time, you should be able to take it again. That seems like it's a pretty light penalty, and in fact not necessarily a penalty, but a gift to the student to help educate them to improve their behavior.
Excuse me, Mr. Bowers, can I just interrupt you for a second?
Yes.
Reflective of what you just said. In some of my discussions with the MIAA, I believe that it either just happened or it's going to happen in the fall, that Bill Gain is going to actually make a presentation to their rules committee that would require the athletes, and as Nancy said, we've incorporated the 62.1 indoor handbook, to go online and take a course similar to that, and it would cost them, there'll be a cost associated with it. And as I understand it, the result of the test or course or whatever you want to say, evaluation, would go directly to the building principal. And that would be an MIAA requirement towards the child coming back on the team. And if they did that, and it would make sense that we would just incorporate it into our handbook. So, I'm sorry, I just wanted, before I forgot.
No, that's great, that's good, that takes care of it, and perhaps reinforces that we should have it in our policy. The other item that is up, the full year suspension. In my assessment, what you get is, if a person's out there in their harming themselves, that's one thing. But when you put them in an automobile, it changes the entire situation. Not necessarily as a passenger, but as a driver. And that the penalty for that should be very severe. And it's a little bit like a robbery or an armed robbery. And we have different penalties for those two categories. And if we're not at a full year suspension, I think we ought to be looking at what additional suspension we should have for that condition. Now, the principal is not in line with that at this point. Mr. Bernard has been pretty clear that he does not think that's a good thing to do. It's, I don't know, somehow it's harming the student or not positive. But again, my feeling is quite strong that we should make a differentiation when the student is involved as a driver of an automobile, because that's where they do harm not just to themselves, but do harm to others. That to me is perhaps the most important of these particular issues, and I think that's what I would hope to get my colleagues to buy into, or get the principal to buy into, and perhaps have him go back to student council. Perhaps we don't put that in this modification, but we bring it up as a subject that he bring before them and see where they think it ought to go. Because certainly the people in the student council tend to be responsible citizens. So I think we've accomplished a great deal with the changes in the handbook, and as far as the full year and the guilt by association, maybe we need to work a little more with MIAA on those to modify their approach. The mandated treatment, mandated education is, I think, where we really ought to be on that. And I'm not interested in treating the kids necessarily. I think we ought to be educating them what kind of things that they do. And we do that, some of that already. We do that with the Mark car crash. We have programs that already do that in general. They just need to be a little stiffer for those who are involved.
I think I assumed that it was educational or instructional based, but it did use the word treatment, so it might just involve clarifying or defining that it's education based. It was very interesting. I mean, I commend for, when you look at policies, your responsibility is to review and look at and try to judge what's effective and what's not effective, and it's hard to have answers to that. I think the MIA is not sure whether the change from 62 to 62.1 has had a deterrent effect, which I think enters into some of their discussions of whether to make the rules stricter because people will break rules, but is it a harsher penalty, or do we approach it another way? And I don't know if there's been any recent studies on this age group on the increasing penalties and whether they've been a deterrent or not, or the impact on them. But the questions are very interesting as far as the authority of public officials and the scope of of public officials, and this is how law even develops, because it hasn't been challenged yet. So it was a very interesting question to look at, and there's no definitive answers, but I feel confident, as I said, that it's more probable than not that the full year would be outside the scope of authority, as well as the guilt by association, and the other. So that's your standard, and your penalties are where you have a little more discretion.
Where do we stand currently with relationship to bullying during the full year? Is bullying going to be a full year issue?
From, the regulations are coming out soon. We expect the regulations to be published, the first set of them, by the DESE within any time now. They were supposed to be out by the end of June, but I think they're behind in that. The legislation is certainly written, and the definitions of a school year, academic year, with that. Because, once again, it's sort of the scope of what is reasonable to even enforce, and the obligation. If you have students that know each other, obviously, from school, and they have a contact with each other in a non-based school activity in the summer, how could a school be imposed with the obligation of knowing their treatment of each other? And when do you define they would know, and what's your obligation to enforce that? It becomes a lot of practical issues with that too. And so the bullying policies are written as the academic year. Your timelines for complying with that, starting to initiate training this fall. The training didn't say you have to have it started by August 1st. It says, September, Labor Day, because that's the traditional start of the school year. So everything with the legislative history of that bill is kind of based to the school year.
The legislation, does the legislation cover bullying for a calendar year? Or is it all right to bully in the summer?
It's saying that the schools are not responsible for enforcing that in the summer, only in the school year. I mean, good question, unless the regulations say something different, which I'm not anticipating. Because your obligations are to have a policy, to train and educate staff and students, and to report. And the reporting obligations, I assume the regulations are going to be defined in terms of when you're serving your role and responsibility as a teacher.
But that's our role is defined as a school year. But the law is written as a school year only. And what happens to bullying in the summer? Is that a regular civilian law that applies?
Exactly. There's all sorts of
So you can't bully people during the rest of the year anyway. But
even
during
your
the school year, we're responsible.
well, and you're not responsible for everything in the school year. Just whether they broadened it from just in the school building and in school activities. They did broaden that on the way to school, to and from school, on the bus, and with knowledge of some of the cyberbullying. They defined the cyberbullying. So that's the two big expansions of it to what you would normally enforce of conduct, is the definition of cyberbullying and expanding kind of the scope of the territory that you're responsible for. For obviously the South Hadley incident, where she wasn't on a school bus, but she was walking. It was right after school, and she was walking home from school. And the question was that problems that happened on the street were brought into the school and into the library, where adults knew or should have known. That's why they kind of extended. You can't, even if the conduct, the yelling or screaming happened out a car window on the sidewalk, but the impact on the safety of the student and the relationships of the student didn't stop at the schoolhouse door. So therefore, you have to assume that you bring your clothes into school with you, and the problems that has, and you have to address those. You have to address those relationships. Then,
With regard to the effect of additional punishment and whether that has any effect on the age group, I think that the the